The House of Commons is not effective at performing its functions in Parliament. This debate is set in a question and answer interview format.
Can I put it to you, David, that the House of Commons is simply ineffective at carrying out its functions if you compare it to the House of Lords?
I reject this wholeheartedly. The House of Commons is very effective in carrying out its functions, given the enormity of what it has to do on a day-to-day basis. Take calling the government to account as an example. There are a number of select committees which are not only active but extremely independent of government that allow the Commons to be held to account. It allows government business to be held into account. Due to their independent nature, they are able to be quite critical of government business and hold the government to account. Twice yearly, the Prime Minister must appear before the Liaison Committee and report about the work of his government. Every week, the Prime Minister takes his weekly questions in Prime Minister's Questions, which allow the Commons to hold the PM to account over his actions and the actions of the government that he leads. As the tradition states, ministers must present policy to the House before deciding to go public with their announcements, to allow for proper scrutiny.
I am dismayed that you class PMQs as an example of calling the government to account. PMQs is nothing more than a rowdy, rabble-rousing shambles of a session. Often nothing meaningful is said. It is quite boisterous, and it is often the PM and the leader of the opposition simply trying to point score off one another. It is a complete waste of time, as even the Deputy Prime Minister in 2015, Nick Clegg, stated. He even went on record to say that he would rather be doing something more productive than sitting through PMQs. And on the topic of PMQs, how often do the PM and the government actually get held to account? Any difficult question from the opposition is usually met with some pithy glib remark and shouted down by members of the opposition parties. The PM's own party are often afraid to ask questions, which may risk them being seen as disloyal to the party and possibly earmarked as rebellious. During ministers' questions, the same applies. You don't want to appear to be too critical, especially if you have ambitions of moving further forwards in your political career. On the surface, it appears that the House of Commons is doing well, but actually it is quite the opposite.
Quite a disappointing characterisation from yourself there, not taking into account the clear strengths that I laid out. Another function that the Commons is very good at performing is representation. We have a far more diverse Parliament than in the last 30 years, with far more women and ethnic minorities than before. At the last general election in 2010, the numbers of ethnic minorities increased to 26 MPs, more than ever before. The number of female MPs currently stands at 148, the highest total ever. Parliament is becoming more diverse as our country becomes more diverse, and it is starting to reflect the nature of the country. It can also be said that there are many MPs who are extremely active in fighting for their constituents. Two spring to mind: the MP for Harlow, who regularly champions his constituents' issues and needs, and the MP for East Ham, both examples of MPs who are active in their constituencies and who fight for their every need.
Two excellent examples of local MPs who fight their local cause. I have no arguments against them. But isn't that point quite an obvious one? Shouldn't every MP who is elected do exactly that? Why else would they be elected in the first place? You are right to make the point that the number of ethnic minority MPs has risen and the number of female MPs is at its highest ever. But the numbers are still overwhelmingly poor. In 2015, 148 female MPs compared to 502 male MPs is not a positive statistic. Although a small step in the right direction, it is still quite far behind given our society today. And 26 ethnic minority MPs is simply not in touch with our society today, and this is part of the wider problem. The Commons is simply not socially representative of the country. Its members are predominantly from a middle-class background. You can also say that Parliament is inaccurately represented in terms of the political party makeup, with Labour having significantly more seats than the Liberal Democrats, despite only achieving 3% of the vote more in the 2010 general election. Smaller parties are often underrepresented, if at all, in Parliament, at the expense of the so-called larger parties. It is in this area that the Commons fail spectacularly.
Fail spectacularly? That is somewhat of an exaggeration. I concede that more needs to be done, but a spectacular fail ignores the positives. the House has very important power, the ability to veto legislation or vote down military action. The government of the day needs to be careful, as such votes can be embarrassing for the government if they fail to achieve the necessary majority. For that reason, this forces government to be mindful of the Commons to avoid any such vetoes. David Cameron lost the vote provisionally authorising military action in Syria in 2011. Although not legislation, it was still an embarrassing situation for the then Prime Minister, who wants Britain to be at the centre of world affairs in many respects. Tony Blair lost a vote on an amendment to his terrorism bill in 2005, which would have allowed the terrorist suspects to be held for 90 days without charge. This is a vital function that the Commons is able to perform, and caused the government of the day to take notice.
However, how often has this happened? How often does a government really lose a major vote in the Commons? The examples that you have given are very few and far between. The government rarely loses votes of major significance. In total, the Conservative Lib Democrat coalition government had lost 6 votes up to February 2015, and only 1 could be considered major. You'd have to go back to the minority administration of Harold Wilson in 1974 to 76 and James Callaghan in 1976 to 79 to see the government lose a succession of votes and for it to really impact upon their performance. While a very powerful tool in the arsenal of the Commons, the chief whips on each side ought to be good enough at their jobs to ensure that party members vote in line with their party's thinking. Therefore, this very powerful tool is a paradox, both powerful and useless at the same time. Many MPs, again in fear of being branded disloyal and potentially being passed over for future promotion, tend to be reluctant to vote against the government and therefore follow the party line.
The House of Commons is effective in carrying out its functions. Your characterisation of their weakness fails to take into account their positives and the good work that it does.